You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I'm Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And just before we begin here, go ahead and hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell for notifications so you know when we release a new episode. All that good stuff. If you're on another platform, do remember to leave us a review if you can. We would very much appreciate that. And as always, visit letstalkcreation.org to find out ways that you can support the work that we're doing financially. And thank you so much for doing that. Thanks everyone who has made contributions to keep this work going. All right, Paul. Today we've got a pretty good episode. I'm actually pretty excited about this. This has been one that I've
me too.
had in the works for months now, and we finally got it on the schedule. So this is going to be good. So you remember we are doing an intermittent series, one of our many intermittent series, on the fall and the curse on creation. Yeah. And we have had many different episodes. We've talked about microbes. We've talked about the immune system. We've talked about venomous snakes. We've talked about parasites. That was a gross episode, but we did it anyway. So we've done all those things. And we need to go back, I think, a little bit to the Bible, because there's a big fad, I think. I don't know that I want to call it a fad, but let's call it a fad anyway. It's a trend. It's a scholarly trend among evangelicals now, especially those who want to argue that evolution is God's way of creating. And that trend is to sort of say, well, when God pronounced the curse on Adam and Eve, that was it. It really didn't change anything about creation. The way we experience creation today is the way God made it in the beginning, and creation is unfallen.
Yeah.
Now, some of those folks will go on and talk about what that means for our experience of creation. They'll talk about what it means for disasters and what it means for volcanoes and hurricanes and tidal waves and earthquakes and all that stuff. And some of them don't. Some of them are just content to say, Bible doesn't say, God's in control. What are you going to do? And as usual, these kinds of big scholarly problems, we can't talk about the whole thing in an hour. It's too big, too hairy, too complicated. So we're going to have to carve off some pieces one at a time. And today's topic that we are carving off of this question of, is the creation really fallen, or is it the way God made it? We're going to talk a little bit about whether God actually cares about the animals, right? So, animals suffer along with us. Animals suffer when volcanoes go off. Animals suffer in earthquakes. Animals suffer from diseases and plagues just like we do. And so does God care about that? That's kind of the question. And we know, from the Bible, it's pretty clear that God cares about us. And he wants to work together, work bad circumstances together for our good. But does he do that? Is there anything analogous to that for the animals? Now, because this is a big topic, and because I happen to know someone who knows a lot about animals in the Bible, we have a special guest with us today. Her name is Rahel Wells. Rahel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be here.
Great. Now, Rahel is a professor of Old Testament at Andrews University in Berrien Springs in my home state of Michigan. Michigan. Good job. And she also has a master's degree in biology. So she is somewhat uniquely qualified, I think, to actually talk about animals in the scripture and animals in God's care. So, Rahel, why don't you just kick us off here? I'll just throw it out there. Does God care about animals?
Yes, I think this is such a good question because, like you said, the Bible is very clear that God cares about humans, and the Bible's written for humans, to humans, by humans, right? So we expect that. It's focused on us. But it is also full of animals. And actually, when I started working on my dissertation, I was originally going to write my dissertation on that topic, does God care about animals? But there was just so many passages I had to focus it, right? So it's actually, once you start looking for animals there in the Bible, they are everywhere. And they are companions to people. They are people's workforce, right? Especially all through Bible times. They are food. They are, sacrifices, right? Representing Jesus, pointing forward to Jesus. So they just everywhere. And then God, especially in the prophets, he calls out the people saying, if you were just like an animal, you'd be doing okay, but you're not even as good as an animal. Right? So
Ouch.
he takes them through this, like showing how animals are more faithful to him than humans are. So they actually come up everywhere. And then, as you mentioned, also even in the New Testament, Paul brings them up saying the creation is groaning together with the humans, waiting for God to come again. So they are all over the place, and even that topic we can't fully cover in this short time, but I think there's some things that we can look at to indicate that. And I'd like to start actually with Genesis 1, because we often, I think, misuse some of the verses in Genesis 1 and misunderstand them in relationship to God and his care for animals. So, of course, you have the 6 days of creation here in Genesis 1, and day 5, God creates animals first, right? Before humans. So he creates the fish and the birds. And he actually then speaks to them at the end of the day. We don't usually really think about this, but there was no humans there yet, right? He made the birds and the fish, and then he says to them, this is in verse 22 of Genesis 1, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful, multiply, fill the waters in the sea, and let birds multiply on the earth. So he's actually blessing, right? Talking to them, telling them to multiply and fill the earth, right? So they have also kind of co-ownership, or at least co-resource. They're co-creatures with us. They also belong here, and God blesses them and wants them to multiply too. So to me, this is just such a cool thing, because we usually just read those verses in day 6, which is God saying the same thing to humans, right? But here he actually starts off by saying it to animals before humans even exist, which I think is just amazing.
Yeah,
so
that is amazing.
And then of course, when God creates humans, he says to them in verse 28, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish and the birds and every living thing that moves on the earth. So he gives them responsibility to rule over the earth. And often use this term in Christian circles as, it's our right to have domination. But this word there in Hebrew implies a just rulership, right? So God is saying, I care about the animals. I want them to be fruitful and multiply. And as you rule, you should also allow them to be fruitful and multiply. So God, from the beginning, he longs for this blessing and fruitfulness and filling the earth of animals as well as humans.
And can I pop in here with a question?
Please.
Blessing. I've been thinking a lot about blessing lately, in contrast to the curse of Genesis 3. So is this the same sort of blessing that, say, Jacob and Esau would fight over because it was so important? Is that the kind of blessing this is?
That's an interesting question. I mean, we don't know for sure. That would have been the firstborn blessing, right? That was a specific one that was given to the firstborns. But blessing is mostly associated with God. Either God is blessing or people are asking God to bless, right? So this is kind of consistent through scripture. And animals, their firstborn are also to be given to God, right? So you do have at least those hints that perhaps this could be connected with that. But it is certainly always like God giving good things to the individual.
Right.
So whether or not this was a firstborn blessing
right,
here,
right.
which maybe it was, if these were the first ones
they're
created,
the firstborn,
they're kind
right?
of the firstborn, like Adam and Eve were, right? So you had this kind of firstborn thing. I don't know, but
it is important. I mean, it's not like today when you sneeze and someone says bless you. It's not some casual thing. The Old Testament definitely portrays blessing as this is serious business here. This is not just something you
Right.
say.
And it's God doing it, right? It's not even just wouldn't be Adam right here. It's God himself blessing the animals and then blessing the people.
Yeah.
I actually think also in verse 28, God is talking to the land animals there.
Sure.
Verse 26, he's talking to only humans, right? And he says, let them have dominion over everything, including the earth. But then in verse 28, he just mentions the fish and the birds and not the earth, which I find fascinating because I think there he's also blessing and talking to the animals with the people. So he does bless the land animals as well, and wants them to be fruitful and multiply. But in verse 26, he makes clear that the humans have kind of the ultimate rulership and they're in God's image, right? Unlike the other animals, but he still blesses the land animals too. So yeah, it's a fascinating thought, right? And then this continues. So God continues always, every time he has a salvation event or a rescue event throughout the Bible, he always includes animals. So we think of the flood, right? He invites all of the animals onto the ark as well, or at least representatives of them. And then when the flood is nearing its end, it says in Genesis 8, God remembered Noah and all the animals that were on the ark, right? So he's like, I don't want them to die either. And then in Genesis 9, he makes covenant with Noah and the animals, right? He makes this very clear, like the covenant with that he'll never bring a flood again is with the animals as well. Maybe we can read that because it's just really beautiful. In Genesis 9, he mentions this over and over and over again, that it's with everything. Genesis 9, verse 9. God said to Noah and his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. And he continues as he's talking about the covenant, because again, God cares not just about humans, but also about animals, right? He doesn't want another flood, not just for the human's sake, but also for the animal's sake. And so he continues this care as he goes through scripture. And then other salvation events, the plagues after the Exodus, right? The plagues don't come on the animals of the Israelites. You just go through, right? The animals are always involved. Jonah, God says to Jonah at the end when he's bringing judgment on Nineveh, and Jonah's like, I don't want you to save them. And God's like, but I do. I care about not just the people, 120,000 Ninevites, but also all the animals.
Yeah.
So every single time when we have like a major kind of judgment event or something like that, God is always also concerned about the animals, even though humans certainly are his more of a concern to him. It doesn't mean he doesn't care also about animals.
It's also interesting in the flood account that in Genesis 6, when we read about the violence and the corruption of the pre-flood earth, that God talks about all flesh being corrupted. And of course, in the context of the passage, Genesis 7:21, all flesh includes the animals. That's not just the people. And also, I was very struck. We're actually going through Jonah at the moment in our church, and I'm very struck in chapter 3 that when the Ninevites repent, it's the people and the animals that are covered in sackcloth. It's almost as if the animals are repenting as well. It's very, very interesting.
And crying out to God.
Crying out to God, yeah.
Yes, and I actually personally think that I'm in full agreement with you. I actually think animals are presented as accountable for things in the Bible. So it's not just humans. Now, God never says that they sin, right? But they are held accountable for things. So they, for instance, are to keep the Sabbath in Exodus 20. Animals also, right? The animals of the household. They are to not kill humans. Even like right away in Genesis 9, after the flood, God says, I'm going to hold animals accountable as well as humans for anyone who kills a human. In the laws and the Torah, in the Pentateuch, you have multiple laws about animals, not sleeping with humans, right? They'll be held accountable for that. When the Israelites go up to Mount Sinai, they're not supposed to touch it. And God says also the animals, right? If the animals touch it, they'll also die. So, I mean, you have a lot of like instances of animals being responsible for things on some level, right? It's not the same level as humans, but they have this accountability, which indicates also God's care, right? If they didn't have a personal level of responsibility or ability to think through that far, it might be more like they're like robots. But I think the Bible portrays them as these personal beings who God cares about a lot.
So are bugs accountable? Are we gonna see a judgment on mosquitoes for killing all the people with their mosquito-borne illness or something like that?
Well, and this is challenging because I think we see in Romans 8 that it's not, again, Paul makes very clear it's not the animal's fault that they are this way, right?
Okay.
So it has to do with humans, right? So because of human sin, animals suffer. The Bible, of course, doesn't talk about bacteria, doesn't talk about any organisms lower than a bug, usually, or smaller than a bug. It's hard for me to know for sure how to answer that question.
Right.
I do find it interesting that some mosquitoes do not suck blood, right? They eat plants. And it does make me wonder if that's how God originally created them and then sin affected them, right? So, and then they start becoming evil, I guess. I don't know. You have that implication, like you said in Genesis 6, that animals are involved in this corruption and violence that's on the earth. And so after that, God puts fear between humans and animals on purpose, because I think the implication is, and otherwise they all kill each other, right? Animals kill everyone, people kill everyone, they all kill each other. So God puts this fear. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if, I don't think all, and maybe this is going to sound crazy, but I don't think all animals are innocent in that way, right? So that animals have some level of accountability. I like to think of them like maybe like a young child, right? They have some knowledge of right and wrong, but like if you taught a young child how to kill someone and they did it, would you hold them accountable? Not in a court of law, right? You'd hold the adult accountable who taught them that. So, but there are some things they're accountable for. They know right and wrong at a young age. And so I kind of think of animals in that way, right? Like biblically, they're never said to sin, but they are accountable for certain things. And so God holds them responsible for that. This even happened in America in the 1800s. Animals would be tried in courts if they killed someone. So they took it very seriously, right? That in the law, that if you killed an animal, you would be killed. And so they would bring the cow or the horse or whatever, the big animal that had killed a human, and then they would sentence them. And of course, they didn't have a lawyer or anything, but they would be killed. And we don't do that anymore, and we kind of laugh at it. I kind of think it preposterous, but at the same time, at the time, they were thinking like, this is, the animal knows not to kill a human. And so there are things for which animals are accountable and responsible for. But yeah, bugs, I don't know. That's harder. Although we do, I'm sure you've seen the research lately that we know now that bugs feel pain. Finding that more and more. So, the smaller animals do have some level of pain. And what might this mean? I don't know, but they are considered nephesh, or animals. Maybe we should talk about that word next. But
we should, yeah. Well, now we're talking about moral culpability for these animals. Right. You already said there's certain accountability there. Are we talking about individual animals? If a lion got out of the zoo and came up here and ate me, would that lion, is that something he's individually responsible for? The individual. Are they individuals? I don't know how to ask that question.
It seems to be, because let's read a passage here. So for instance, let's look at Leviticus 20. Leviticus 20 verses 15 and 16. This has to do with bestiality. So if a man lies with an animal, he shall be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. If a woman approaches any animal and lies with it, you shall kill the woman and the animal. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. And then Genesis 9, of course, this is even if you want to argue before the law given to Israel, right? So this would be more applicable to all humans and all animals. Genesis 9, verse 5, for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from every man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed, for God made man in his own image. And so God makes very clear that an individual animal is held accountable for killing a human. So, I mean, I struggle with this to know exactly how to define it because, again, it's not sin. Animals are never said to sin, right? So could it be that this is simply, the results of human sin with animals, or is it more than that, because I mean, animals also seem to know that they're not supposed to kill humans and they only kill humans in defense, right? I mean, we see this today. Usually that is the case. Animals are not, there's a rare animal, right, that is going out to hunt humans. They're rare. I mean, it does happen every now and then, but they are in general very fearful of humans. And so they're going to run from humans rather than trying to kill them. And God says that he put this fear in them. So an animal that then goes outside of that bounds seems that they should know whether they should do that or not. And those individuals, I mean, God uses animals to also help people all through the Bible, right? He asks the ravens to feed Elijah. He asks the fish. In all of those cases, he speaks to them. It says very clearly he speaks to them, and then they respond and they go do what he says. So they are able to hear God and respond to him, and on some level, right? It's not the same as humans, certainly, but there's some level of responsiveness, relationship, communication. I mean, I'm even struck by thinking about Eve with the snake in the garden, that she's not like freaked out, right? Neither is Balaam with his donkey when the donkey talks. I mean, and I think this is true. Like my cat, I love my cat so much. She's actually has cancer right now, and I don't know how much longer she's going to live, but I've had her for 17 years. I know her. I've had other cats in the past. She's very different, right? She has her own personality, her own desires, her own interests. I understand her communication for the most part. I mean, there are times when I don't get it quite right, but she has a certain meow for this, a certain meow for this. I know when she does this certain thing, she wants this, right? She paws me to get me to hold her. And, I mean, they communicate with us so much so that I think if she did talk to me, I'd probably respond, before it hit me like, wait a second, my cat's talking to me. Wait, what?
Yeah.
But when you're close to an animal, like it seems Balaam was, I mean, the donkey says to him, why have you been beating me? Haven't I been your donkey? It's a she in the narrative. She says like, I've always been a good donkey to you. What's going on here? And so Balaam responds without thinking, which implies to me that there's a close relationship he has with his animal. And it makes me wonder too about Eve. Perhaps they had this ability to understand animals more than we do now, or they were just close to them, right? And it would not have been such a surprise. I mean, I think today, if we had that, we still would just be like, all right. But they were a lot closer to animals. They spent a lot more time with animals. And so they could probably have some level of relationship, deeper relationship and knowledgeable relationship about them.
And animals, I've got a pet cat too. Actually, my cat has cancer too, and we're not quite sure how long we're gonna have her. But she knows when she's done something wrong.
That's also true.
She'll go and hide. She knows when she's done something she shouldn't have done, and so it's that mysterious relationship that they have with God. It's something we can't understand, exactly how that works, but I'm sure you're right that they, just as they can have a relationship with us, I'm sure they can have a relationship with their creator in some way that we don't understand. I'm sure that's correct.
Right. And I'd like to read it just from Psalm 104 to kind of show that that's the case. I mean, there's many passages we could look at, but Psalm 104 talks about God's relationship with his creation mainly, right? And it also talks about humans in there. But at the very end of the chapter, when God is talking about the animals in the ocean. He says, let's pick it up in verse 24. So Psalm 104:24. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships. He mentions humans briefly, right? And Leviathan, which you formed to play in it, which is like a big sea creature. We don't know exactly what it is, maybe mythological, but at least it's living in the ocean. And then verse 27, these all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. So the animals they're looking to God for food, right? And this is true throughout the passage, actually, where it indicates that God is like giving food to the animals. And then when God hides his face from them, when they can't see God, they are distressed, right? They're dismayed. They struggle too. And so you have this indication of relationship there between God and his creatures on some level. Again, I don't think it's the same as humans, right? They don't have the capacities that we do in full, but there's some partial things there that animals have throughout scripture. And this is not the only passage like that. There's many that indicate God's close relationship with creatures.
Mm.
And as I mentioned earlier, they're nephesh, right? So nephesh
Yeah.
is the Hebrew word for person, which we usually translate soul or creature. So in Genesis 1, or in Genesis 2, when God creates Adam and Eve, he calls them Nephesh Chaya, right? He breathes into them, he forms them and breathes into them, and they become living souls, is how we usually translate it. But the Hebrew word is Nephesh Chaya, which is living creature, and it's the same phrase as in Genesis 1, when God creates the birds and the fish and the land animals. He says they are Nephesh Chaya. So they have breath, they eat food, they drink water, they need shelter, right? And in Genesis 2, we also find that God actually formed them from the dirt too. And they have his breath of life as well. We learn here in Psalm 104 and other places where when they die, the breath of life leaves them. And so they have basically the same characteristics as humans do. And we understand this scientifically as well. We are part of the animal kingdom as humans. So the difference the Bible indicates for humans is that we are in God's image, which seems to be related to our responsibility on earth, that we are to act as his image bearers, act as he would if he were here. How would we treat things? How would we act? How would we live? We are the rulers, but we are to be good rulers, as if we were following God and what he would do if he were the ruler here directly. So this nephesh, personhood, I mean, that carries all sorts of connotations. So I don't usually use that word unless I have time to explain it like I just did now. I'm not trying to imply that animals are better than humans or equal to humans, but just that they also are individual creatures who have individual personalities and connections with God and with other creatures.
So, yeah,
So
I think I've been thinking, yeah, as I said, I've been thinking a lot about this lately as well. And you're right. There's a very difficult, Jesus talks about, when he talks about worry and in the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about, if God cares for the animals or the grass that's here today and gone tomorrow, won't he care for you? And there's clearly implied in that the hierarchy of value, right?
yeah.
It's not that these things are not valuable to God. It's not that God does not care about them. He clearly does. But he cares about us so much more. And it's the conclusion there should not be, oh, God doesn't really care about what happens to animals. The conclusion should be, he cares about us. We're more valuable than an animal. So there is a hierarchy of value, which I think is really hard for us in the modern world, where there are so many people arguing that, animals are people too, and we should we should treat them just like us and they have rights and so forth. It just seems very alien to say, no, there's clearly a hierarchy here. And yet that seems to be exactly what the Bible is talking about. That there is not, it's not all persons are not made equal. At least not in the sense of Nephesh. All Nephesh are not made equal. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting though, like in one of my professors at Wheaton, where I did my PhD, talked about this triangle. So you've got God, land, creatures, right? With this triangle of covenant relationships. So God has a covenant with the land, God has a covenant with creatures, land and creatures have a covenant. But humans are in the middle there, right?
Right.
Making sure that the relationships between all of these are valuable, are working. So it's not that, I don't know that God thinks of it as a hierarchy, I guess,
Okay.
is what I would try to
All right.
say, right? Because
Yeah.
again, hierarchy would imply or would lead people towards the place of like, oh, it doesn't matter what I do to animals because they're less valuable,
Yes.
right?
Right.
Because in the original creation, there was never an intent for death,
Okay.
right? At
Okay.
least that there's everyone eats plants. Well,
Sure.
plants die, right? But you don't have organismal death. And so God's, however you want to take that, right? I mean, God values all life. And in fact, when he does allow people to eat meat after the flood, this is why he says no blood, right? Because I want you to value the life of the animal. So even though you're going to have to eat animals to make it, especially after the flood, right? There's no plants or very few, and it's difficult to live. And so, but he still always values the life of the animal. So even when he gives sacrifices, they're not to eat the blood because the life is in the blood, right? And the blood then, of course, also points to Jesus. And so animals, in some ways, yes, are less important, but in other ways, they're more important, not in terms of value, but in terms of they are innocent, in a sense, from sin. And so they are then able to point to Jesus in ways that humans can't, right? So God, that's why God can use them as like examples of righteousness. And, you know, if you could just be like an animal to me, you'd be doing okay, but you're not, right? And like implying that animals have this ability to worship God and serve him faithfully when humans don't. So it's this kind of paradox, right? That
Yeah.
that the humblest, maybe least important, then become the most. And maybe you could argue the same as with humans, right? We are, in the grand scheme of the universe, we are the ones who sinned, we're the ones, you know, blah, blah, blah. But God then rescues us and elevates us, right? And so I think kind of animals are in this same place where, you know, sacrifices then become this way through which people can see the innocence of the future Messiah to come and his willingness to die for them. And I don't know. I mean, there's a lot there, right? There's
There
a
is
lot
there.
a lot packed into animals and God's care for them. So in fact, even thinking of sacrifices, we usually think of the Old Testament as full of them, but what God intended was not very many. One in the morning, one in the evening, to cover kind of the people's the sins that they were unaware of. And then when they would do a major big sin, they'd bring one of their own animals to sacrifice. I mean, I always thought of this, like if I had to bring my cat to sacrifice her, I would never sin, right? Like I would just be like, no, I don't want to, you know, so it's just, I think later in time, as the people started turning away from God, they were like, well, if God wants one sacrifice, he wants 200, and let's bring all of these animals and kill, you know, so much so that they lost count at the time of the dedication of the temple. But this was never what God asked them to do. They started offering way more than they were supposed to. And this is why I think in the prophets, God says, hey, whoa, sacrifices are not really what I'm wanting. I want your heart. I want a relationship with you. And, you know, you're just doing all these sacrifices rather than actually living right. You know, so the sacrifices were intended to point forward to the Messiah, not to be this like slaughter of, thousands of animals every day, which then the people later did. So again, even there, though animals die for us, God never intended it to be a huge amount, right? He was trying to, as much as he could, I think, protect life within that context.
So can we shift gears here a little bit? You mentioned the image of God and dominion. So if we are to reflect God to creation in our dealings with creation, what does that mean for animals? Because I have some people who tell, you hear certain voices in the culture now who say we should not have any animals. We should not have pets. You're enslaving an animal, and that's wrong. The only place that's right for that animal to be is wild and free in its original environment. I remember a number of years ago, I was watching a news program here in the United States, and they were talking about this amazing ranch in Texas that has giant herds of basically near extinct antelope from Africa. And they had this other person on there criticizing it because it's not Africa. It's not good enough. You have tens of thousands of these things on your ranch, on your huge ranch, but it's not Africa, so it's not good enough. So do you have some thoughts on proper stewardship of animals, I guess?
I mean, it's challenging, I think.
It is.
Because God, of course, does give the earth to both humans and animals, right? That is clear in Genesis 1 and throughout the Bible. Animals are co-creatures with us. So we do have a responsibility to allow them to live as much as possible in their natural environment. I do think that's clear. But we also have from the very beginning where animals are being domesticated. And I even think there's hints in Genesis 2 before sin, right? God has Adam name the animals, implying that though he doesn't find a human there to have a companion with, and there's still some companionship, right? He knows their names. He knows them enough to be able to name them and recognizes, oh, there's no one like me here. But that doesn't, of course that's God's intent, but I don't think that's his only intent. I think there's implications there of God's desire for humans and animals to be in companionship. So, what that looks like is challenging, but I do think as much as possible, we should be advocating for keeping as many animals wild as we can. Although I'm struck by there's a recent article, I think 2018, it's not that recent, but still recent-ish,
Recent enough.
on how of the actual numbers of animals on the earth right now, only 4% are wild and 96% are humans and livestock that we are, basically raising for us to eat. So we're taking up, good portions of the Amazon, et cetera, are being cut down for livestock, feed or livestock. So, I think thinking about how much meat we eat is really significant too, because that's a resource use. And now there's so many people on earth where it's not sustainable to eat the amount that, for instance, Americans usually eat. So obviously, I don't think it's possible for everyone to go to a vegetarian diet, but even like in America, for instance, we eat 73 pounds more meat per person per year than we did 40 years ago. So we're eating more, right? And that's not sustainable on earth for the wild animals. So if we're going to have space for wild animals, we've got to, change our diets. I think that's part of what I would say to that. But secondly, God does give instructions for when we do have domestic animals or animals we're using in research or animals within our sphere of how we're to care for them. And Proverbs 12 is one example of this. Well, there's many laws in the Old Testament as well about, making sure they don't, if they're working, let them eat, right? Like give them rest. If they're having a burden too heavy, take it away from them, right? So I think those are all principles of kindness, care, compassion to the domestic animals under our roofs. But then this is Proverbs 12:10. Whoever is righteous knows the soul, that's the Nephesh word there, has regard for the life, is how my translation has it, but of his animal. But even the mercy of the wicked is cruel. So God holds people accountable for how they treat the animals within their sphere. So I don't think the Bible indicates that we can't have domestic animals, but that we should also be very careful in how we care for them, whether they're animals we're going to eat or companion animals. We have a responsibility for care and compassion and kindness, which may mean choosing meat that has been not from an industrial slaughterhouse and choosing meat that's, grass fed. And, so you're trying to give the animal as much, freedom and good life as possible before it dies, which is more expensive, but then that maybe means we eat less, right? So
Yeah.
it helps to kind of be that sustainable thing. And yeah, I'm troubled by how much we are decimating the wild animals. So I'm all about, preserving that as much as we can. But I mean, I also recognize that we have a lot of people on Earth. So how do we hold that in balance? It's not easy. And we have
It's
responsibilities in both ways, caring
yeah.
for the wild, also caring for the domestic in our care. And I think there's a lot of animals, like people will get rabbits. I've heard this, right? And then they'll just feel so bad for them and release them into the wild. Well, those are domesticated animals. They're not going to survive.
Yeah.
And most of them immediately get eaten by, birds of prey or coyotes or something. So because we've domesticated animals for so long, we can't just release them to the wild, right? It's not going to work anymore because of those changes in their biology and their genetics. And so therefore, for those types of animals, I think we do have that responsibility to care for them in a domestic sense. But maybe for this other type of animal, at least you could argue, okay, you're preserving the species. And I think this is what we have to consider too. Some animals that are going extinct in places, where do we try to preserve them? Okay, it's not Africa, but at least they're living. I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to know the answer to all these things, and I definitely do not. But I think the Bible holds both of these valuable to God, both the domestic animals, which are considered part of the family, actually, through the Bible. Your domestic animal is your family, and the wild animals, which are pretty much always portrayed as God caring for them because they don't have a human family, but that humans are responsible for providing that care as well. So like Leviticus 25 with the sabbatical year, every 7 years they're supposed to leave the land fallow, and God specifically says they're for the wild animals to eat. So it's the land too, but whatever grows, humans also still are responsible for making sure there's available land and place for wild animals.
I find this whole discussion very interesting because we're presupposing that the mitigation, the minimizing of animal suffering is a good and moral thing to do. But of course, if Todd introduced this episode by talking about this sort of theological trend at the moment where people say, well, actually, humans are fallen, but the creation isn't fallen. And animals suffering like this is just natural. It's just the way God set up the world to work. If that's true, why is there this concern for minimizing animal suffering? Why do we use anesthetics when we take our pet to the vet? Or why do we want to care and be compassionate for animals? If animal suffering is really just morally neutral, it really it's not sinful for if suffering is inflicted on animals, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I think that's a question to ask the people who would say it doesn't matter, right? Because then why do you care about your pet suffering? But
Right.
Yeah.
but I do think it leads to that question of, even for me who believes that there's been a short time of life on Earth, right? Suffering is still hard, right? Even if it's 6,000 years of animal suffering, that's still difficult. And difficult to wrap our minds around. And I think human suffering, animal suffering, however, right? And so I'm struck by the seeming indication in Romans 8 that animals, their suffering will be redeemed as well. Maybe not all of them will be there in heaven, but the implication is they're groaning, they're waiting for the redemption of humans because they're involved in it. So, and this goes back to like God all through time has been saving animals along with people. And so I have a sense that because I do believe God cares for animal suffering and animals do suffer, and that does matter, that God is going to make that right too. And I don't know exactly how that is going to look.
Yeah.
Will every single animal be in heaven? I don't know, but I think there's hints that they will. For instance, I would like to read from Romans 8 because I think it kind of gets at your question. So Paul says this in Romans 8, verse 19, for the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. So we're groaning, creation is groaning, and we're waiting for redemption, right? And then in Revelation, when John is describing heaven and the redeemed there around God's throne, and this is clearly after redemption on some level in Revelation 5, right? It's like saying, you've redeemed us, everyone's here. Verse 11, I looked and I heard around the throne and the living creatures and the elders the voice of many angels, numbering myriads and myriads and thousands of thousands, saying, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and glory and honor and blessing. And I heard every creature in heaven, on earth, under the earth, in the sea, and all that is in them, saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. So implying there's animals there, right? And the Old Testament indicates this too. When it talks about heaven in Isaiah 11 and 65, it talks about the animals going back to their kind of vegetarian roots. They're no longer eating each other. So there's changes that happen in them too in heaven. And this at least seems to indicate there's some sort of redemption for animals too. Again, I don't think they sin, but because they were affected by our sin, they are also affected by our redemption. So,
I've also wondered about 1 Corinthians 15, because that's an interesting passage where Paul talks about every seed has its own body. And he's talking about the resurrection. He's talking about the seed being sown in death, and then the natural body being sown, and the result being a spiritual body in resurrection. But then he says in verse 39, all flesh is not the same flesh. There's one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, another of birds. This is in this context of there being different seeds which are sown. And it just made me wonder, is Paul thinking that the animals and the birds and the fish, are going to be, they have a particular body which is going to be sown, and in resurrection they'll receive a body that's appropriate to the seed that was sown? I don't know, but it's kind of an intriguing reference.
I love that. And it makes me think of Psalm 36, which was actually just such a cool passage to me. This is where the only place where the literal word salvation, which is usually used only for humans, is used for animals. So Psalm 36:6, your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Humans and animals you save, O Lord. So if there's any proof text you need, I'm not a huge proof text person. I'd rather look at the whole of Scripture. But if you want a proof text for does God care about animals? Will they be in heaven? Does he care about their suffering, right? Does he want to save them and redeem them from their pain? I think this is the one, right? Where it's like God is not just caring about humans. Though he cares more about them than animals, he still cares about animals. And they are in relationship with him, and he wants to save them, and he wants to redeem them and redeem their suffering, because God is all about, and to me, this is one of the key things. If I'm going to think about theodicy, the how do I justify the suffering in this world, is that God promises to make it right and redeem it. And if we really believe that animals suffer, then God is going to make that right too. And I don't know exactly what that will look like. And maybe there is even some, I mean, this is a really crazy thing, but maybe there is even some, if animals have some accountability, right? God teaches humans through suffering. Not that he causes it, but he teaches us lessons through it. And maybe he's teaching animals lessons too. I don't know. I mean, it's given me thought in that, for instance, in Isaiah 53, the Messiah is compared to a lamb going to its slaughter with peace, right? And with humility and willingness to give its life for the human. And then that's pointing forward to what Jesus does. And like, what do animals think about in that context? I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. We don't know what's going on in their minds. And so we'll probably not know until heaven. But I do think that kind of redemption theme is what God's all about, right? So why would he not want to redeem the suffering of animals too, which he already asks humans to ameliorate as much as possible, right? To lift the burdens off, to give, make sure they're not working too hard and all of this responsibility already.
And, along these lines, it's always struck me as really curious the way John in Revelation portrays, or the vision that he sees of the final consummation is a new heaven and a new earth. And it would be a sad earth indeed if it was just us and the angels and Jesus. The earth implies a lot more than just us. And the very notion that God would make so many different creatures. If God was only concerned with what we're going to eat and what we're going to wear and how we're going to get along in life, we don't need manatees. We don't need all these things. We don't need jellyfish and bees. Well, maybe we need bees. But you get the point, right? We don't need millions of species in this massive diversity on this planet. There's clearly something more to this than just human utility. It's not just for us. Right. It's God cares about this world. Well, we're running short here. I do want to come back to something you said. 40 years ago, Americans ate 70 pounds of meat less per year than they do now. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
That's
and I mean, probably
crazy.
Some people it's even more than that. But yeah, the numbers out there are pretty wild.
It's terrifying. I mean, I remember 40 years ago. That was not that long ago. That's very disturbing. And, part of it, I think, is, when I was growing up, most of the adults I knew were involved in farming somehow.
Right.
My dad worked as a truck driver, but he grew up on a farm and he knew about farming, and we had a garden, and my grandpa was a farmer. And now I don't know how many of my acquaintances are farmers anymore. I don't think most of them are farmers. We've all shifted our economy, and meat is now a thing you just go to the store and buy.
Right. And I think even just that alone, right? Many people, maybe not 40 years ago, but at least 50, 60 years ago, they probably killed most of their own animals, right? And so you become much more like aware of like, oh, right, this animal died for me, I'm eating it, right? Now we just don't think about it. And it's, my husband, I've been a lifelong vegetarian, but my husband grew up hunting, eating meat, whatever. And for him, it was just always been fascinating talking to him because they had such sacredness of the animal, because they would go out and kill the animal themselves and drain the blood and, process the meat. And it just made it much more real, right? You're not just, it's not just this package that you get. Right. And it, I think in some ways made him value the life of the animal more, right? To recognize that he's actually causing, and it just also made me realize I could never do that because I love animals too much, right? But I think there's probably a lot of people like that. Like when I talk to my students about, because we talk about earth care and How do we care for the planet? And this is one of the things I address because, I want them to think about, I know I'm not going to convince them to be vegetarians for the most part, but like how much meat are they eating and what is the impact it's having on the planet? And, we're not living in, there's a lot of people around the world who don't have a choice, right? They've got to eat meat. There's not fruit in season or what other things, but we have a lot of options here. And yet we're the biggest meat consumers besides, I think China is now rivaling us, but, what are we doing to mitigate that problematic use of Earth's resources?
Right.
So if I can, even if you don't care about animal suffering, right? Like it's problematic for the Earth as a whole. I mean, if everyone became a vegetarian, we could feed probably 3 times the amount of people on Earth because each pound of meat requires about 16 times more resources than a pound of plant food.
Wow.
So, you're just, some of them much more. Like I think shrimp is like 60 times. I don't know. It's like a lot. So, even just eating lower on the food chain is helpful, right? So, anyway, just thinking about those things because we don't usually think about them, right? And like we just think about eating food. We don't think about the impact it's having on the planet, on other animals, on other people, right? Which there's not enough food. Famine is a problem around the world. And World Health Organization came up with I'm trying to remember the name of the article, Livestock's Long Shadow. This was actually United Nations. There's several of them. This was about 15 years ago now, but showing how a lot of the worldwide famine is due to, again, buying up people's land that they're subsistence farming on to produce food for cattle, for meat production in, first world countries. So, and then those people, like for a few years have money, but then what do? They don't have any other livelihood. They were farmers. And so, it's just famine can be traced back to a lot of our high levels of meat consumption as well. So, even if people just are thoughtful about these things, whether they care about animals or not, it does affect other people and the earth as a whole. So
that cooler full of packaged meat at the grocery store, those are individual animals that had lives and worship the Lord in their own capacity and praise the Lord in their own capacity, and we should be a little more thoughtful about how we utilize those resources. I think that's good. And if nothing else, 70 pounds of meat a year cannot be healthy for your individual body, right? Not a good thing. All right. Well, Paul, any final thoughts and questions here?
I've got lots of thoughts and questions, but we don't have time for them. But no, this has been fabulous. We'll have to have you back again and talk about some other things too. So.
I would enjoy that. Yeah, I would enjoy talking to you both.
I think Romans 8 is a topic that needs to be addressed. The groaning of creation. There's a lot of discussion about that, and there has been a lot of discussion about that for a long time. So, and you've mentioned it multiple times. So maybe we'll have a Romans 8 episode in the future here.
Great. Sounds fun.
All right. Well, thanks for being with us. And Paul, I guess if you got no more thoughts, we'll wrap this up. Don't forget to like and do all that social media stuff. Share it with your friends. Let people know that we're here. Visit letstalkcreation.org to find out how you can support the podcast. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.